We are now going to move to our closing keynote. So Chris Larkin is an established composer and sound designer for video games and the moving image. His work and achievements include the score and sound effects for one of Australia's biggest indie success stories. You might have played it. Little game called Hollow Knight, as well as evocative indie point-and-click Tohu and music for Cannes World Film Festival award-winning VR documentary Thin Ice VR. Chris will be talking about his own experience of discovering and sticking to a limited set of core techniques for designing game audio while navigating the oversaturated market of feature-rich software and plugins in his talk. That's a different title than what I have written down, so I'm going to read that one. Making your sound your own sound.
Actually, so we're going to be looking at kind of making your own sound, but also making sounds for games generally, and making soundscapes. So, I'm just getting my notes here. And I wanted just to define what soundscapes are. And I'm using the term soundscapes because we often use the word audio to sort of cover both music and sound for video games. But I like soundscapes because there's something immersive about the word, and we're going to talk a little bit about immersiveness as well, and some little tricks I learned to try to get myself into an immersive space, and also to hopefully get the player into a sense of immersiveness with the audio. And I'm going to be talking about core building block techniques, and the reason that I'm using the word core here is that they're treating tools and techniques for their core and integral intention or their function, and it's a bit of a back to basics talk, and the idea of limiting your tools and your techniques to a specific set and doing pieces of music or soundscapes just with that set of techniques. So my last highscore talk, which I did in 2019, was on thematic development, theme and variation, and some leitmotif stuff. So basically traditional compositional concepts and how I worked some of that into Hollow Knight. But this talk I'm going to try and focus on a bit of a different area. So I've noticed a couple of times when I've talked to people, when I've said that I do the sound effects as well as the music for Hollow Knight, some people don't actually realize, and it's an area that I haven't talked about too much, so I've decided to look a bit more at the sound design element of some of the work that I do, but it's actually going to be done through a bit of a lens or a musical lens, because it came from a very music origin. And I also discovered through doing both sound design and music, is that there's actually quite a lot of overlap. And especially when creating soundscapes for games. And in that overlap, these core techniques lie, I guess you could say. So, as I mentioned, I sort of went into sound design from the music side, from that origin. And hopefully for some people who are just doing music, who haven't considered doing sound effects, might see a similar kind of journey. But maybe there also might be some aspects where things could be led from the sound design stuff through those commonalities. And while working on this talk, I realized that I'm also touching on a process of creation, or I guess the process of my own creation, but just the idea of what the creative process looks like generally. And these tools kind of sit in the center of this, I guess you could say, a three-step process. We start with chaos and ambiguity, kind of like, so I liken the process of composition to be a case of organizing chaos. Chaos means, I guess, any possible way that a music composition could go, and your core techniques or your tools are kind of also like the rules. So if you're improvising at your guitar or piano, your core techniques might be something about how you organize your harmony, or like if you're writing maybe something like a drum and bass track, the certain pattern of the kick and the snare, might determine like the style of the music you write. So those are the sort of tools and limitations for music composition. But it was actually through sound design where I realized the rabbit hole of this chaos and ambiguity goes really deep in the realm of possibility. And embracing chaos is like super important, and you can invent more of your own rules to shape where you want to take that. I also like to think of this as kind of like a bit of a really simple, I guess you could say almost dumb way of looking at subtractive synthesis. So chaos is kind of like your noise source, and the core techniques or the tools you use is your filter section, and then we get the audio outcome. The things that you choose to do in that middle section definitely determine the shape of that filter. So much is like emphasis is applied on how you deal with that middle section. But I didn't really think of it this way, and I didn't really dive into how deep sound design and editing could go until actually I went to the Elder Conservatorium of Music in Adelaide. This is one of the buildings from that school. And up until this point, especially up until around 2009 or so, the core techniques that I used, aside from playing music at the piano and writing some stuff on paper, I largely used MIDI for most of my compositions. In fact, most of it was done with MIDI, so note on one side, so you have note on, then note off, and then sometimes there might be some CC data in between, but I wasn't really thinking much in those terms. I didn't really do much with expression and dynamic shape. Might start with something like forte if I'm using Sibelius, and oh, we need to go louder. Oh crap, so I'll go FF. Oop, oh, not loud enough, FFF. I wasn't really thinking about the, full dynamic shape of things. And I definitely worked on that while thinking about and learning about classical composition, but there were some things that I learned through doing sound design while at the con as well, where this kind of the realm of possibility sort of opened up. So traditionally in classical music, the idea of a composer is kind of at the start of a chain, a process chain. You have your composer who writes the music on paper, and then eventually, say, the performer might perform it, they might work with the composer, and then later on you'll have a recording device, and the idea of the recording device is to capture that performance, maybe for later replication. But we learnt about the orange, the orange? What sort of orange is at the con? We learnt about the origins of this idea that the composer can compose with the recording device or the recording technology. And this idea wasn't really much of a thing until the mid-20th century. And we learned about this idea of musique concrète, and this is something that was coined by this guy on the left here. And musique concrète is a process of recording sounds in life and nature and taking these recordings and editing, changing, manipulating these sounds to make new compositions. And they largely use tape editing techniques. And if we look back to the sort of technology that they had at the time, it was quite limited. I mean, at the time they were thinking this wasn't limited at all. It was like the new frontier of a lot of things. But the technology that they had was limited by the specific editing processes that they could do with tape. And I went to a class at the con and we learned about this, and we had to do an assignment where we had to make some stuff inspired by these techniques. Before I get into that, I'll just show you what those look like in my own summary, I suppose. And one of the most important things that they were able to do with tape is change the playback speed of tape, which would therefore change the pitch. This is something that's, I don't know, for sound design, it's almost like the most integral thing that you can do with creating sound effects for games, films, art, but there's obviously a lot of other things, so like reversing, changing the direction of the playback, cutting, splicing, looping, delay, and yeah, some other machine-assisted processes, so they could overdrive the signal. They also had plate reverbs back in those days. So we had a similar set of rules that we had to create a composition out of. And we weren't allowed to use any presets, we weren't allowed to use any pre-existing sounds on the DAW. So the process was to use the DAW essentially a bit like a tape machine and record something as the source material. So I used a piece of paper, and this is what I came up with. ominous ending. Thanks. So yeah, I didn't really consider doing something like this before. I was making stuff in Fruity Loops actually, and trying to get into making my own drum and bass and techno. So why would I grab a mic and a piece of paper and try to make a drum kit out of that? I got that nudge, I suppose, from doing this assignment. And it's this crazy idea of like experimentation and diving into the unknown that I think is essential for sound design. And this happened from here, and then I had some other opportunities where I could do it again later. So fast forward a couple years, around 2011, I ended up working on a game called Hatland Adventures. And I had to make music for a level of this game, a cave level. And I was trying to make stuff all day, and nothing was really coming together. It was a mixture of instrumentation. It was a little bit electronic, a little bit acoustic. But for this particular level, the ideas weren't coming together. And at the end of the day, I kind of gave up. And I decided to have a go at writing a piece of music using primarily a similar set of editing techniques that we had in that assignment. So what I did is I sampled a small set of notes from a kalimba and used some basic audio editing techniques to construct the entire track. So the source material is not actually a real kalimba, but the entire piece is constructed from samples from this. So I'm going to try something I've never done before, which is to switch over to a past recording, something I prepared earlier. I'm doing the cooking thing with this video. And yeah, also, this track that I wrote was done quite a long time ago, probably in Cubase 6 or so back then. And it's a little hard to remember all the things that went through my head at that time. So we're going to go back and rediscover these techniques together. So here we go.
So up here is an instance of, or was an instance of Contact 4. It's no longer installed, so I can't show you, but this is the source material I used, and it's just a 6-note motive, which sounds like this. And I decided to basically treat it as a bit of a study and keep repeating this little motive every 4 bars and try and do some different experiments with it. And in this case, there's a lot of cutting going on. Actually, we'll probably look at it in more detail later on, but almost everything in this piece is audio editing from that same source material. There is one other instance where I extracted a new bass line from a higher set of 3 notes from that same kalimba sample, but it's all played around with in the audio editing system in the DAW using sort of really basic techniques. So anyways, let's have a listen. Okay, I've decided to fade it out there because I introduced the drum loop, and that's the first time a new sound is introduced to the piece. And while it does break the rule, it does go pretty far without touching any new samples or recordings. This is all done using those same two segments from the kalimba sample. And it kind of became a bit of a like a snowball rolling down a snowy hill. It kind of just got bigger and bigger. And part of that was helped by the fact that I had a very stable bass line and riff that seemed to allow it to compose itself. But yeah, anyways, we're going to look at breaking this down a little bit, and I'll try and be as quick as I can. So I decided to set up the start of the session with two instances of the riff, one on the left side panned to the left and one panned to the right. And the reason for this is I didn't like glitchy or edited sort of music that is mono all the time, and I wanted to force myself to break into the stereo realm. And I don't know what possessed me to do this. This was like 12 years ago or something, so I can't remember everything I did, but the cool thing about having two separate channels or characters is that they can play off each other, and it ended up turning into a bit of a call and answer between the two of them, I think. I don't know. Anyways, we can see things like simple things like reversal here, which is that. So basically just taking, and I'll just demonstrate that. So cutting, you hold, in my case, I'm holding the Alt key. I could just make an incision. Holding Alt and then dragging makes a copy. And I've got my shortcut, Control Alt R, to do a reverse. So that recreates that little effect there. Looks like I did a nice little glitch moment there, which is probably taking something like this. I'll use this as our little test area just to demonstrate. There's a faster version. But yeah, that's that. Those are those little edits. Reverse. More reverse, but just done in a different rhythm. So this is still just... Oh, I see what I did. These are actually crotchets, it seems, judging by the bar numbers here. So every crotchet, I made an incision and just reversed every second one. And I did the opposite on the other channel. So we've got a kind of a left-right reverse effect. And then so each repeat introduces a different concept, I guess. What have we got over here? All right, and this is just more pitch shifting, basically. So Cubase has a handy thing called direct offline processing, but you can also do this with Audio Suite in Pro Tools. And I just haven't used many other DAWs in a similar way, but the process of changing the pitch of a sample, from what I've been able to observe and use to my limited extent in, say, Ableton Live, it's actually pretty straightforward to change the pitch of a sample. You should be able to just do it. And in this case, I don't think I always change the speed of it. So we're breaking free of, we're starting to move away from tape limitations and having it sort of starting to check out what you can do with the digital technology here. So in this case, I've used pitch shift. So it looks like I've pushed it up 11 semitones. And then I pushed it up another 2 semitones, so another tone. So what's that? That's 13 semitones above the original pitch. So if we actually do this again, let's grab, I'll just demonstrate, it won't be the same pitch, but I'll just demonstrate what that looks like. So it's a case of taking that. Now I've got a shortcut for it, so let's use our spare track down here. Shortcut, Alt Control P, let's push it up 13 with time correction applied. So this is now, we're no longer thinking about slowing or speeding up a tape machine anymore. This can actually preserve the length of the file if we tick this, and it's using an algorithm called Elastic to keep the audio as preserved as it possibly can. So we press apply. And the cool thing about doing these sort of things in the digital domain is when it tries to keep it intact when doing these dramatic changes in pitch, it often introduces aliasing or new tonalities. And then sometimes you don't want it, but when you're experimenting, a mistake is sometimes the best thing ever. So if we were to then take that artifacting and actually change the speed of it, so I'm not going to apply any digital time correction on it and just simply slow down the file, we have something like, and then I'm going to follow the rabbit hole on this just because we're just looking at a concept here. Let's keep going another octave. Bit of a fade out. Now I can hear some cool wind-like tones in there, something in the mid-range that I kind of like. So I'm going to use EQ to extract this. So I'm just cutting out the low end. And there's something breathy or cold or like windy cavern about this that I like. And so what I'm doing here is I'm adding silence and I'm putting these together. That's a non-destructive edit to put a clip, make a clip longer, and that's just silence over here. But I've got this shortcut that I use all the time called bounce selection. And it's a destructive thing in Cubase, and once you do it, you can't actually go back to those processes that were applied before. On my end, it's Control-Shift-B. And this has now added that silence onto the file destructively. The reason I did that is because I want to apply some reverb, which is my shortcut Control-Alt-V. Can really exaggerate that. And it's no longer a percussive sound, it's sort of becoming this sort of drony sound. I'm hearing a harmonic. Maybe this is derived from the earlier tone. Whoops. So yeah, you can just sort of, just discover, there's a new note there or something. And then you could use that to assemble a new melody. there's some examples of, I guess, what I've been doing in this piece. So okay, this one's probably good to talk about. Up until this point in the piece, everything has been really close to the ear. And I suppose I experimented with a bit of reverb here, but it was more as a blur or a smudge effect to draw out that sound. But here I distinctly labeled this channel as a far, and it's got a reverb on there. So yeah, whatever you put onto that channel is going to sound like it's further back. So we're starting to experiment with not just left and right, but a sort of a deeper perspective. Because I was like, okay, what can I do next? And each of these 4 bars was a little bit of a challenge. Like, what's the new concept I can introduce? So yeah, there's our reverberated note. And yeah, it kind of just goes on, and it's just a process of experimenting with kind of things that you can do with audio files, and then it gets to the point where I'm starting to play around with the idea of sequencing new melodies. Now this looks like it's gone through a few iterations of being edited and then baked, so I'm not sure if we can unpack this. Yeah, there's nothing there. So this is actually a bit more destructive than I remember. And I'm hoping that, I don't know, I'm hoping I can kind of show that you can assemble, because there's no, let's see. Yeah, I just want to show there's no inserts on any of these tracks. Oh, there's one here. What's that? Oh, it's just another reverb. But most of the tracks, here's our main left and right channels. There's got no inserts on them. Our bass doesn't have anything on it. Oh, we've got a limiter on some bass harmonics, which awesomely doesn't actually sound like a bass. They're kind of like that. So I found some sort of harmonic quality in, oh, it's probably derived from some, you know, artifacting from time stretching it, manipulating the time. It's got some weird algorithm to time stretch it. This didn't get preserved, but I imagine this is probably a low cut or a high pass filter, and running it through a bunch of reverb. So we've got pitching it down a note. I don't think there's anything more specific we need to unpack from this. But while this does break free of those traditional old school tape techniques a bit, it doesn't add too many processes, and it doesn't use too many different plugins to make this type of music. You can achieve a lot through manipulating pitch, time, and changing the timbre of sounds through EQ, adding reverb, reversing, bit crushing, rinse, cycle, repeat. Or like, I think there's probably about 6 to 8 things there. My future self might clarify those things in the next slide. Who knows? We'll see. All right. Thanks for now.
Thanks, past me. So to clarify, yeah, these are pretty much those techniques. And I just wanted to emphasize that we did see FabFilter EQ there, but that at the time of making that track, I was just using Cubase's default inbuilt EQ. And most of the processes and plugins are kind of bundled with the DAW, or at least you can make similar kinds of tracks without having to buy a lot of new plugins. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of point that out. And it was kind of, I guess, a bit of a challenge, a study piece. And it ended up in the game and was one of the I guess, one of the more successful tracks of that game. So, yeah. And yeah, this idea of like creating a piece with a concept, or just trying to just make a whole thing just out of one or two sounds, it's something I've been doing quite a lot, and I continue to do, and I think it's sort of a strong way of trying to make game soundscapes. Yeah. I also want to just point out that each of these has their own keyboard shortcut. And I guess the reason for this is largely, I mean, you can make things faster, there's practical reasons for that, you might want to meet deadlines and all those sort of things. There's also the idea that like concepts and new ideas can happen really quickly, so if you can work faster, that means you're more able to catch them. But there's another like really important idea of why using keyboard shortcuts is important. And I think it's because you want to reach this state of flow. The goal is to reach a state of flow. You don't actually need to be that super conscious of the specifics of the tools you're using as you're using them. The ideal is to intuitively utilize these processes in an unconscious way, to think about the dynamic shape you want when you want to use compression, or to think about the spectral shape you want when you want to use EQ. And this is what I mean by core building block techniques, like the core element of these tools. They're not necessarily also defined by the aesthetic designs of the graphical user interface or the marketing surrounding the product, or even the added features. They're intrinsic to what, say, compression or EQ is, to use those two as an example. And these elements stay true regardless of new software developments. So for me, this has sort of been something I can hold on to as the landscape keeps changing around us. And yeah, so thinking about our tools in this way, we can really start to get into that state of flow. And it's in this state of flow that we can reach new levels of experimentation and sound manipulation. And it's through this process that I like to think it's a bit like manipulating clay. We stretch it, we shrink it, we cut it, we flip it upside down, and we shape it through our core techniques. I didn't realize how malleable this process was until I actually started diving into doing some sound design work, both in, like in that example, some music work, and also some sound effects editing work. It can get quite messy. And this is actually how messy it feels to me while I'm doing it. It's not necessarily how messy it looks. So if we look back at the DAW, like there's certain things about the design of those environments that neaten things out. But this is what's going through my head. Yeah, and so earlier in the talk, I showed a flowchart of chaos and ambiguity as a three-step thing, and where there's like, sorry, I've just got to find my spot. Yeah, it's like a three-step thing, where chaos and ambiguity is at the top, and then the middle section, the filter section, are your core techniques. We can draw some similarities between that and this slide, where I suppose chaos could be like the clay that you use to create your piece. And then the way that you shape that clay are those core techniques. You're filtering the chaos into your new compositions. But sometimes we actually don't have enough clay to begin with. And so that we actually can use our techniques to create more chaos and more material to work with. And then we come back around again and start shaping it again. So this process ends up looking quite circular. And it's with this circular process, it starts to take on the form of one really important aspect of game development, which is iteration and prototyping. This process of trying it again and again and changing the way and the shape that it sounds. By embodying this process of experimentation with sound and audio, you're starting to look at iterating and prototyping on your own sound. And it's quite close to what the other members of the team are going to be doing in the game development environment. They're going to be running their own form of chaos through their own set of techniques and rules. They're fine-tuning different aspects of the game to find the best mechanics that work. And yeah, and I think it's really important if you're getting into game audio to sort of be aware of the types of process that they're going through, and also to include them in your own process of iteration and prototyping, to share audio and music concepts with them early on, because you never know what ideas that might spark on their end. especially if it's early in game development. In fact, there's been lots of instances where I've shared ideas with game dev teams, and we've been able to just talk, oh, that might actually be a good idea for over here or over there, and yeah, it's just really good to do that earlier on. So another aspect or benefit to creating I guess a bit of a space or time for experimentation in this way. So you can start finding sounds that evoke a feeling of immersion, and that's something that's really important for us as game audio designers to make our audio and our music immersive for the player. And I wanted to talk about this just a little bit. So you want to have a sense of immersion for representing the world. It's sort of like a diegetic idea that the sounds of that world, they're from that world. But you also want to have some sort of emotion attached to it, and some more of a non-diegetic or non-world sort of sense of immersion, kind of representing how the world feels or how it makes you feel when you enter it. And I think you have to sort of consider these two things as we make sound for games, and it's through these two that, yeah, creates a sense of immersion through sound. But there's also another aspect to making audio that feels immersive that I think is just as important. It's actually to make you more immersed as you're creating it. And it can actually sort of ignite the creative process and further inspire more compositional ideas and sound design improvisation. Sometimes you need that initial kick or starting point. And for me, I use a little trick to try to trick myself into getting immersed in these ways, and I like to call it drone composition. And it's the thing that can underpin the start of a compositional process. It's a gateway into another world, and I use it to almost like meditate when I'm at the piano. I'll create a drone first and start improvising over it, and it can usually, I guess, form the building blocks of that piece. And yeah, so in order to create drones, I actually employ some of these techniques that I showed earlier. It's a bit of a sound design process. It's a bit of an experimental process. And I've had a few instances where I've made drones out of bowing things. And one of these things that I'm going to show next is bowing an acoustic guitar with a detuned bottom string, slightly broken. You get the idea. And basically making like a mini sample library out of these recordings. And I'm going to hand back to my past self again. It's going to show us the result. And here we go.
Okay, so here we have our samples, and I've exported them like kind of 1 or 2 bows in each sample, so they don't go too long. I'm gonna use 8. I kind of like that there's a distinct fundamental note, but also there's a bit of activity happening with some of that bowing noise that I like. So the idea is to try to make a drone out of this. So first up, I'm going to start with trying a version of it down the octave. Quite like that. And I'm going to explore using just the husky element of it. And I'm going to add a delay. In this case, it's a ping pong delay. And the thing that this actually does is it plays back the delayed signal and bounces it between the left and right channels, depending on how spatial you do it, left and right fully when spatial is at 100%, or it just becomes a mono delay if spatial is at 0%. So maybe around here. I'm hearing a sort of a note in there. And I think I'm going to try and use this note as our bass. So just duplicating, doing a crossfade, and here we have a drone with a delay effect. Now, how can we use this? Just going to quickly apply the same delay to that first. So now we have a sort of an undulating swell. It's kind of becoming the pulse for our track. Maybe this could be every 4 bars, say if this is in 120 BPM. Here we go. There is a bit of a, there's a knock where I hit the guitar slightly there, but yeah. So that's all I really wanted to show, just a quick bass for a track thrown together using the source material.
So yeah, here you are. And like I said before, I often use these as a basis or starting a track. And I wanted to show you some examples of where I've done this in some pieces I've written. Subtle drone throughout this whole piece, and I'll just play the very start of it again. I'm not sure if these speakers, bring it out, but that's actually a manipulated flute sound that I used as a basis for that track, and then this one as well. Again, I won't play the whole thing, but the sound in that one's derived from some bowed string sounds, and there's some hissy elements that I can't remember how I made. But sound design, you dive into chaos, you come back, and you don't know what hit you or what you just did. It's like going into a dream. So yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to show about that. Yeah, and the other point I wanted to make was that if I can make myself feel that sense of immersion, then hopefully the player will too. And I think that's something that is worth exploring when we're all doing some sound and music for games, is that sort of feeling of, I guess, empathy, or trying to find a way to make the stuff that you feel as you make it reflective in their experience as well. Yeah. So as I got into this world of sound editing and design, I was starting to experiment with sound effects work. A friend of mine was an animation director at a company in Adelaide called Monkey Stack, and he wanted some sound or some audio done for a video. And it was actually a video for a potential playable demo, but it was just in video form initially. And I was like, okay, let's do the music. And he was like, okay, I need some sound. And okay, so we're going to do music and sound. And he's like, okay. But eventually it ended up becoming more of a sound requirement And it was a situation that I got another nudge. And it was in this job, it was around the same time I played that first example, around 2011, that I started refining these core techniques. And I continue to use those things today. And I'm hoping that this whole thing shows a bit of a journey from music-based sound design getting into doing sound effects. And in order to show this, I've actually made a bit of a video where I've tried to recreate some of the Hollow Knight sounds. I just took some footage from an early trailer that we had, and I tried to just make the sound effects for a bunch of the enemies on the spot. And I did a voiceover, but this time it wasn't at the same time I was making the sounds, but it was actually a later voiceover. So to embrace this chaos, let's dive back into it and have a look at the last video example. I will start talking in a sec. I'm just showing the footage here.
So, looks like we're going to focus on that first hit that this enemy does. I can't remember any of the names of the enemies, so there you go. It's got a big club thing. I'm currently just using Basshead as a sound browser. This is me hitting some paper with a piece of fabric. And I'm just pummeling it. Recorded on a Zoom H4n at 96. And I'm just looking for some meaty kind of impact sounds. So this is pretty much just paper and fabric making this stuff. You just record it for close proximity, it can get quite nice and heavy. Starting to sound a bit deeper now. But it is still kind of cardboardish, and generally we're kind of looking for some other sounds just to fatten it out. I think I'm looking for some rocks and bricks. This is some stuff we recorded at a Foley room in Adelaide. Some debris. Looking for some more debris, it looks like. Oh, no. He's looking for rocks. From memory, I think I was looking for some sort of dust, a bit more dust, dirt kicking up. Yeah, something like that. Oh, it's a bit too lo-fi. Add it in anyways. Can always take stuff out if we do too much of this stuff. Slightly larger rocks. Oh, that's sounding cool as it blends in. It's funny, I'm trying to try to explain my thought process that I had. Oh, okay. Looking for an explosion. I think I like the snare, bright tone in this. Just as a smack, initial smack, like a noise burst. I remember thinking, oh, I just want to add a kick drum, but I thought, no, let's go for something a bit more unique. And so we're starting with the highs, and I think I'm going to add some sort of low end, there we go. Still pretty bright. Looking back, I probably didn't need to go that far high. Yeah, all right, there's the low end. So I'm hearing this for the low end, and I'm going to cut out the highs and just use the lows, because we already got heaps of highs. Let's make our subwoofers do their job. Awesome. Hey. Now I am making a new track, and I'm recording. I've basically got my default input to be my output. So I've just rendered everything down into one track by soloing everything, and I've made it 100% wet reverb. And the reason for that is, and not using send effects, is because I want to bake this into the file, and I want to have full control over when this tail ends before I set up my in Cubase it's called cycle market for export, but in Reaper I think they're regions or something. Anyways, it just ensures there's not going to be any clipping at the end of the file if you render and do a reverb that way. Okay, skipping ahead in time, we're going to have a look at the final result.
Cool, there you go. Thank you. So, like I said, I'm hoping that shows a bit of a sort of scope of these sort of editing techniques in the context of both sound effects and in music. And even in the instance of editing pre-recorded sounds, I think there's an element of chaos, almost to what you like search for. For instance, paper's been a bit of a theme, I think, and I've actually been using paper quite a bit in my sound design process, especially for enemies and bosses. And I think you kind of have to, just think in a weird way to come up with that stuff sometimes. So yeah, at the start, I showed this flowchart, and I've sort of broken it down a bit more. And yeah, I'm just going to go through it again. We start with ambiguity and chaos. We dip our brains into this realm of diving out of MIDI and into the world of experimentation. We move away from presets and embrace the irrational. It can feel a bit stressful or scary sometimes to walk into this space. We may not have the full guarantee of where it's going to go. But the idea is to give it a go anyway. And you have to make a certain space for this. You have a go with experimentation in what I'm calling your lab. You can also make both a physical space for this type of work, and you might already have this, but you can also dedicate a time space for this work, carve out time to embrace this process of experimentation with sound. And in this space, your laboratory, you give yourself freedom to make mistakes. There is no wrong or right way of doing these things. You are iterating and experimenting with the goal of discovery. Mistakes are often desirable, so therefore you have nothing to fear. By arming yourself with a limited set of tools and techniques, you're also keeping your process clean. A limited selection means you master these techniques, and therefore eventually you reach a state of flow. So we shift our process from tool selection to art making. Once these tools are defined, we don't actually have to think about them. We rather embrace the journey of composition and design, these tools being the extensions of our creative intent. While surfing, a surfer does not think about the specifics of their surfboard as they ride the waves. Rather, they are in the flow of the moment, of nature's ebb and flow. Similarly, we must all work towards a state of flow, to make use of the tools limited, decisive, and fluid, so that we can focus on what matters most, creating great and immersive sound and music for games. So, define your tools, embrace the chaos, and of course, remember to play and have fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Good thing I've got that Britney mic on so I can move things while I talk. That was absolutely stunning, and it's such a pleasure to get to see some of your process as well. I swear I could watch you do a live stream, just showing off how you make...
Oh, cool. Thank you.
You should... Hey, you should
I might give it a shot.
Should I move this close to you? I feel like I'm very far away.
Yeah, sure.
These chairs also not as easy to move as I thought. All right then, never mind. Yeah, stunning. I also really loved how you talked about starting with a drone, because it reminds me of like painting theory where often they say to put a wash over the canvas before you start because it just kind of gives more depth and tonality to everything you put on top after.
Yeah, for sure. I've actually started trying to do a bit of digital painting and just like blurring your eyes and sort of forming a base. You kind of have to get the vague shape of things first, I guess. But it sort of applies to music composition as well, like having a bit of a sketch on an instrument or something really helps. So.
Do you have any advice on what specific skills you need to build when you're very new to the video game world, but not completely new to composition?
I guess, yeah, some of the skills in that would be good to build, but also I think if you haven't got, I suppose, any jobs yet or like looking for getting some gigs working on games, I think building up a bit of a demo reel is a really good skill to have, like having something that really captures the imagination of the people that you're showing it to. It's got to be punchy, but also show a bit of, I guess, scope for your ability. But sometimes having like a specific strength and showing like what your strength is and spending some time working on that as well, building those skills in your time as well is really good.
Which was your favorite sound effect to make for Hollow Knight?
That's a good question. Oh, okay. So there's a boss sort of death sequence that we use once you've defeated the boss. Actually, I think this is how it goes. Like you eventually it reaches the end of its HP, and then it kind of gushes. But we're not overtly like this is blood, but it's sort of a vague idea of gore. And I have a recording somewhere of my friend's mum's cheese casserole, and I ran that through a granular processor, and that's the sound of the the boss dying.
Only her casserole would do. It just had the right consistency. How do you deal with any anxiety or discomfort that comes with the chaos and ambiguity of creating audio, especially in the early stages of the process?
Yeah, that's tough. And it always like there's a moment of uncertainty, and the interesting thing is that sometimes like new sample libraries or potentially new tools can offer a release to that uncertainty and anxiety, and it can become really tempting. And I've definitely gone down that path of, oh, there's a plugin that might actually save me, so I'm just going to do that. But and sometimes it does.
More gear, more plugins. That's always the answer.
Yeah, but I've been trying to do a process of doing that lab thing, and I just wanted to sort of show that because sometimes you have deadlines arriving, or maybe applications where you want to submit a demo, so it can become hard to justify spending that time to just explore sound. But I think every time I do it, I notice something or find something new, and I just really encourage it just as a mindset of I'm just going to spend like the next 3 hours today and just give it a shot. Who knows? Like the worst thing that you can find, which is probably actually kind of one of the best things, is what not to do sometimes. So yeah, it's a process of elimination as well.
And speaking of noticing things, I did notice how in your first example you had a track called Thingy, and then another track called Copy of Thingy.
Yeah.
That is some fine file management. How do you deal with short deadlines? Do you still go through the initial chaos state if you're on a very tight schedule? Is there always time for chaos?
I think there's always time. You have to shorten it, unfortunately, just due to the realities of how time works. But I think just, and actually there's some interesting things by sayings or prompts by Brian Eno. I think they're called oblique strategies. That's sort of another similar way to go. Like you can create chaos just by like thinking of the next task that you have to do, and it could be a very important task bound by a deadline, but just approach it in a slightly different way. And I think that can be a way to go about it.
We're running a tiny bit over, but I'm going to because we have very good questions. I got a thumbs up. What are your thoughts on pitching oneself before you have much in the way of a finalized or well-constructed portfolio? Is it better to wait or shoot your shot? That's a hard question.
I'm tempted to say go for it, but I also think it's important to just meet people, and I mean, if it's say it's submitting a demo for a job or something, you can show your friends as well and your colleagues and get some feedback and refine that. Does that sort of answer the question?
You know, I think maybe it's also the difference between like having a fleshed out portfolio and having a skill set.
Yeah.
Because I would think it maybe matters less about having a full portfolio, which is obviously important and great, but maybe don't shoot your shot if you don't have the skill set, because I assume that can lead to bad outcomes and potentially a bad reputation.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I suppose getting onto a job where you have to do something like ADR recording, but you've never done ADR recording before, like that's probably not a good way to start it. But yeah, I think if you're able to sort of find an instance where you can find someone who's doing that specific task and like talk to them and maybe even like take them out for coffee and learn that way, there might a mentorship might open up in that instance. Yeah.
Do you often use drone composition or only when you want to create a particular kind of track?
I don't always use drone composition, but I just want to say that sometimes the drone or that single layer can end up becoming the basis for some other processing, and I didn't have time to talk about it, but I use granular processing a lot, and I make patches on samplers and granular synths. So this is basically the process of taking a single layer and turning it into a polyphonic instrument that you can play on your keyboard and compose with that. There's almost always some sort of underlying soundscape when making tracks, and in some cases it might actually be the environment loop that I've made for the area that forms the basis for a track as well. But otherwise, yeah, it can also just be, oh, the drone is actually a piano sketch or something. So.
This process seems to work best starting with real sounds. Do you do this much starting with digital or synthesized sounds?
Yeah, sometimes I do. And actually, there's occasionally a synthesizer element in Hollow Knight, but it's more like a rounded off, like an organ tone, sticking to the more sine wave type timbres. So yeah, trying to keep it organic as much as possible. But you can push a bit of naturalisticness or humanness into the synthesized sounds by automating volume like with your hand, so that there's like a sense of dynamic shape and phrasing to sounds as well.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us, Chris. The only man that I know that can make paper sound both scary and like a sick beat.
Sweet. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.